So thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here today. I'm glad to be introduced by a graduate of the Kennedy School, Public Policy Program, and a number of folks I saw or said hey to, whom I know, but most I don't. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to try to take about 10 or 15 or 20 minutes to talk to you a little bit about the book and about China. And then I especially look forward to the questions and answers, since the book pretty much says what I think, at least as of this time a year ago. The book's been out for just about a year now. And it's a topic that I continue to be consumed by virtually every day. So for those of you who follow international affairs, and that's all of you, I don't need to tell you China is a front page story almost every day. When I looked at my FT this morning, the first 4 stories go from Trump's tweet about the meeting between Mike Pompeo and Kim Jong-un setting up the visit for the summit, and the live fire exercise that China's conducting today in the Taiwan Straits, to the latest on the tariff front. So let me start with 3 bottom lines to tell you where I'm going. Then I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and then we'll be open for discussion. So on the economic front, as you've noticed, noise about a tariff tiff or even a tariff war, we're now at a little bit of a lull from my point of view, where both the American administration and the Chinese have taken a step back. But I would say expect things to get worse before they get worse. So, secondly, on a more positive note, most of the expert community is quite skeptical about the proposed summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un. And I must say, there's nobody who can look at this picture as a student of international affairs without smiling. So if tickets were sold to be a fly on the wall, watching the meeting, there'd be a very high price. But unlike the consensus, I'm betting something's good going to come out of this meeting. We'll see, but that's my bet. And thirdly, in terms of China itself, if you haven't seen China in your face and in your space, either you haven't been watching or just wait. So there's 3 bottom lines about where I'm going now. Let me go there pretty quickly. So the book does many things, but I want to summarize in terms of, again, 3 points. To introduce you, or for this group, I suppose it's reintroduce you to a great thinker, to present a big idea, and to pose a most consequential question. I'll start with the tweet-size answer to each, just out of respect of Washington today, and then I'll save it for each. So, the great thinker is Thucydides, and I'm glad that Adam pronounced his name correctly. Just so that for sure you learned something this morning, in unison, 1, 2, 3, we're going to say his name. Thucydides. One more time. Thucydides. So if you go home and explain to your spouse or your child or your neighbor, I met today a great thinker, they'll ask you his name, and if you tell them Thucydides, they'll be impressed. The big idea is Thucydides' trap. So this is a term I coined a half dozen years ago to make vivid the insight from Thucydides that when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, in general, poop happens. So, Thucydides wrote about classical Greece, where, as he said famously, it was the rise of Athens, which was the upstart, and the fear that this instilled in Sparta, which was the dominant power in Greece for the previous 100 years, that made the war inevitable. So think about the rise of Germany 100 and a few years ago, and the impact that had on Britain, which had ruled the world for 100 years, and World War I. Or think about the rise of China in the past generation and its impact on the US today. So Thucydides' trap is the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. And the third point is essentially the subtitle of the book. Can the US and China escape Thucydides? Or will we follow in the footsteps of Athens and Sparta, or Germany and Britain, and find ourselves this year or this decade in a catastrophic war? And my answer to that in the book is a very professorial no and yes. So no, if we settle for business as usual, for diplomacy as usual, for statescraft as usual, then we should expect history as usual. And history as usual in this case would be a war, at the end of which everyone who survived, if they did, would say this was insane and catastrophic and destroyed all the things that we cared about. In much the way that at the end of World War I, all the parties looked around and said, how did this happen? What did we let happen? And how catastrophic was this for all our hopes and dreams? So no, business as usual, history as usual. But on the other hand, yes, as Santayana taught us, only those who refuse to study history are condemned to repeat it. So there's no iron law that obliges statesmen today to make the same mistakes that the Kaiser made in World War I, or that Pericles made 2,500 years ago. So by studying history and looking at successes and looking at failures, sometimes we can do better. So this book is not about fatalism. It's not about pessimism. Actually, I'm an optimistic person by chemistry. It's about realism, about being real, about the dangers that we face, in order that we'll summon the kind of imagination that's required to deal with it. So that's 3 tweet-sized versions. Let me say just a bit more about each. I've been in China now since the book was published in Memorial Day in 2017. Xi Jinping had already become seized of this idea, so the Chinese are all seized of the idea. And Thucydides' trap is now part of the bloodstream of the conversation, both in Washington and Beijing. So just before Christmas, I was there for 5 days and saw all the folks in their system, including the number 2 person, Kuan Yew, who it was 2 days before Christmas. I was about to come home, and they said, well, Kuan Yew would like to meet with you to discuss Thucydides. Can you stay tomorrow? And I said, well, I can stay tomorrow, but I then have to go home because my wife will shoot me if I'm not home for Christmas. So in any case, we had a very long and thoughtful discussion about this. The Chinese are absolutely fascinated by the idea that there was somebody whom they hadn't heard of who was roughly a contemporary of Confucius, and who had a big idea about a historical pattern that's repeated itself often. And Wan Qishan in particular reads his books, so he's interested and knowledgeable about it. And then I was again back in Beijing for another 5 days, 3 weeks ago. And again, I had a chance to talk directly and listen to all the leaders below Xi Jinping. So the premier, the person who's the economic czar, Lu He, who I had the good fortune to have. He was a student at the Kennedy School 20 years ago, so I've known him for quite a long time. And when I came back, I'd been in Washington the week before with H.R. McMaster, who's the National Security Advisor, and who's a friend for a long, long time. And I said, people said, well, what's your takeaway? And I said, well, my one-line takeaway would be, or my one-paragraph takeaway, that if Thucydides were watching, he would say, everything is right on my script. And these folks seem to almost be entranced, as if they were in a Sophoclean drama that assigned them their roles about which they had no choice. So, like Oedipus Rex, the gods are determining that Oedipus is going to kill his father and marry his mother, and then discover that he's a monster. And Thucydides would say, that's why I wrote my book. These playwrights who thought that gods controlled all men's choices were not correct. My book, as he says, The Peloponnesian War, is about choices human beings can make despite the fact of the forces that are pushing them to a place they don't want to go, if they act wisely. So Thucydides, to stay here for a second, was the father and founder of history. History defined as just the facts about what happened and the choices human beings made and their consequences without the benefit of external determination by gods or spirits or other forces. And if you read his book, and I would urge you to do this, for free you can go and download his book, and what is it called? The History of the Peloponnesian War. And just download book 100 pages. And if every other page doesn't knock your socks off, check your pulse. So this is a great thinker, and he has great ideas. In fact, to try to spur your efforts in this space, at the beginning of every chapter of my book, I have an epigraph from Thucydides. So Thucydides had many ideas. This book is about one. So that's Thucydides. Second way, Thucydides' trap. I have not been a student of China for most of my career. I studied the Soviet Union. I was an old Cold Warrior, part of the nuclear debate and discussion. I've been interested in American foreign policy in general and decision making. But about 15 years ago, I was writing a book on Kuan Yew, or preparing to, beginning, who was the father, founder, prime minister who built Singapore. And he would say to me, Graham, you should look at China. And my old professor at Harvard, whom I remained good friends and colleagues with ever since, Henry Kissinger, when I would see him, he would say, Graham, you should take a look at China. And I said, wait a minute, I'm already into my career. China, there's so many people, there's 5,000 years of history, I can't even keep track of the dynasties. It's not my subject. I'm going to work on my Russia, Soviet Union, collapse into the Cold War. No, you should look at China. So about 15 years ago, I started reading about China and trying to learn more about China. I was, generally conscious, but it had not been my topic. So in trying to make sense of what was going on, some time ago, it sort of dawned on me. And as Henry now says, this concept of Thucydides trap is the best lens available for looking through the news and noise of the day to get to the underlying dynamics. So if you want an assist in trying to make sense of the news every day, as you read about China, think about Thucydides trap. In China, we have a rising power that has risen further and faster and on more dimensions than ever any state in history. So a state that was nowhere on any of the international league charts 25 years ago has now become a rival and even surpassed the US in many dimensions. Because Americans mostly haven't got it, or only slowly waking up to this, the first chapter of my book tries to give you a jolt. So I don't think you'll find a better 20 pages to kind of get your attention about what's actually happening. So never before has a country risen so far so fast. And its impact on America, our America, in which for all of our lives, we've been accustomed to being at the top of every pecking order. So much so that it's part of that's who we are. My wife says about me, that I'm not just a red-blooded American, I'm a red-necked American. So I come from North Carolina, and that if you wash the cosmetics off of my chest, it would say, USA is number one. I think that's who we are. I think that's who we should be. I think that's who we have been. I think that's created a better world. All that I buy into. So the idea that there's another country that's becoming as big and strong as we are, no. There's something wrong with that picture, in my view. But I think it's the reality that we're coming to have to adjust to. So in the book, I give you a short version of a quiz I give my students at the Kennedy School in the course that I taught last fall and I'll teach again this fall. And the quiz says, when could China become number one? And it gives them 46 indicators. And they have to fill it in like a quiz. And they put, so the most billionaires, the largest middle class, the fastest supercomputers, the largest GDP. And they write 2020, 2030, 2040, not in my lifetime. Okay? And then I show them a second chart. And the title of the second chart says, already. So wait a minute. All these things have already happened. Most Americans still don't get it. But the US has the number 2 economy in the world today. Well, that isn't what the Wall Street Journal says, or even the FT. So they keep insisting on using the old yardstick. But if you look at the IMF website, or the CIA website, and look at the yardstick they think is the best yardstick for measuring the size of a national economy and comparing them, it's called purchasing power parity, now that's down in the weeds, they believe since 2014, China is the largest economy in the world, today 20% bigger than the US. And will by 2020 be half again bigger than we are. Well, there's something wrong with that picture, you bet. Okay? But I would say that's the picture. So a rising China, as Thucydides taught us, there's a rising power syndrome. What is a rising power thing? You can even think of it in terms of, upstart and an incumbent in the companies. Uber and the taxi industry. Or Google and the news business, or basically Google and Apple and everything. So the rising power thinks I'm bigger, I'm stronger, and I got bigger and stronger because I'm doing the right thing. So I deserve more say. I deserve more sway. The current arrangements were put in place before I even got here. Don't take account of my interests. And the ruling power thinks, wait a minute. Who provided the environment in which you ever grew up to be big and strong? You should be grateful. You should help support this structure. That history is played out over and over. In the book, I look at the last 500 years of history. I find 16 cases, 1-6, which a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. 12 of them in war, 4 of them in not war. So to say that war between the US and China in this competition is inevitable would be wrong on the record, not correct. The war between the US and China, let's say it again, is not inevitable. But to say that the odds are not good would be correct. So, jump to conclusion. The book is mainly about diagnosis, understanding the problem we have, that we Americans and Chinese have together, of trying to manage a relationship in which a rising power is continuing to rise and a ruling power is continuing to feel threatened. And if we were to let this situation proceed to a war, at the end of it, we'll both have lost everything we care about. So it's not a war that you'll win. This is a war both parties will lose in terms of what they really care about. So that's insane. And we can study the past and learn from it. So what to do? What to do? So the book is about the diagnosis rather than the prescription. And as I say in the book, Washingtonians find it very frustrating because in Washington you have to describe the solution to the problem in the same sentence that identifies the problem. But of course this is not a Washington fixable problem. This is like a condition, a chronic condition that we're going to have to cope with over a generation. And at the conclusion of the book, I have some thoughts about getting us started. But really what I'm doing now in my mind share is looking at the question or trying to explore the question, how can we escape Thucydides' trap? And to conclude, I would say simply that my current best thought is more of an injunction than the specifics. So if you recognize you're going into conditions of extreme danger, then that should lead you to be extremely imaginative about how to cope, and extremely agile and adaptive in adjusting to the situation. So we need now some imagination well beyond the orthodoxy of the security community or the Washington community about how the US and China could, in Xi Jinping's word, he calls it inventing a new form of great power relations. I like the idea. Now we have to give content to what would mean a new form of great power relations. So I'm thinking about that topic, but I'm looking for ideas. And I suspect that some of the ideas that'll end up being the most helpful will come from unlikely sources. The bad news, and you all are in this business enough to know pretty well, is that there is no monopoly of wisdom in Washington. There's no monopoly of wisdom in Harvard. I can tell you for sure, having been there for a long time. There's no monopoly of wisdom in Beijing. So these are just poor people like us thinking to the best of our ability. And I would say, folks like you have every reason to be imaginative about this, and maybe even have some thoughts that are, I suspect that when we get the shape of this solution, which I'm optimistic about, it'll include ideas that on the first blush seem nutty, or crazy, or radical, or just, oh, you can't say that. And for inspiration, I go back to the invention of the Cold War strategy, which occurred between 1946 and 1950, in which all 6 pillars were, upon first hearing, regarded as completely out of the box. So when George Marshall went to Harvard in June of 1947, this is a year and a half after World War II, and says, I have a good idea. Why don't we tax Americans who are exhausted after a war and thinking they have to build the America now, 1.5% of GDP a year, and send the money to Europe to help rebuild European countries, including Germans, who are just killing us. People did not say, oh, that's a great idea. You're insane. What are you talking about? Forget about it. This is not reasonable. So I would say, think of some unreasonable ideas. Now, that's probably enough to stir the pot. Any questions? Sir.
Doctor, do you think that the United States is going to join the TPP in some way or another? And if so, how does that affect it? Or does it affect in any significant way our relationships with China?
Okay, it's a good question. It's about TPP and whether the U.S. is likely to join it. So each one of these topics are great ones, and we could go on for a long time. TPP was negotiated, and I think if it had been possible for the U.S. to join, this would have created a club with a set of rules for about 40% of the world's GDP, which would be a counterbalance to China in a useful way. So strategically, I thought it was a good idea. That's point one. Point two, unfortunately, the elites' view about international trade and TPP and the American public's views have become completely divorced. So TPP was trashed in the campaign, not just by Trump, but even more viciously by Bernie Sanders, who was the energy in the Democratic Party. So basically, a lot of the country has walked away from the free trade orthodoxy as we've known it, and that's a big problem for us here domestically. Thirdly, Trump then flirted with the idea of TPP last week or the week before when people said, well, maybe this is a counterbalance to China. But when he looks at the details, he won't be there. And I think actually in his meeting with Abe today or yesterday, Abe will tell him what means TPP, and Trump will say, this is another one of these terrible trade deals that take advantage of America. So I would not expect us to be in TPP in the near future. Finally, what I would say, and quite surprisingly, so TPP was driven by the Americans, and we put the package together. When it collapsed, I thought it was finished. And then, miraculously, Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, stood up and put the thing back together again in the most outstanding instance of Japanese leadership that I've seen since World War II. So if Abe hadn't got into his domestic problems, I think we would see a lot more from him in this front. But in any case, for putting it together for TPP minus USA, I still think they did a good thing. Please?
Well, if you look at the last 10 or 15 years and you think about the major changes, two of them stand out as the advancement in technology and the collection and data. Big data has just been a major factor. Now, I'm not an attorney, but it seems to me that a lot of, or how much of a role do you think international dispute resolution, a platform, should be developed that's much more robust, or could be more robust and more sophisticated, to help resolve a lot of these disputes that are taking place. It seems to be today that so much of these disputes take way too long to resolve. And we have the ability, we're not using it, to create a much more robust environment for solving these things.
Okay, there's several questions there, so that's a good one. So there's no doubt that we live in the IT era, and that in the Chinese version of this story, they say the next wave is IT plus. So in their 2025 program, having a leading position in IT plus, and then after that comes AI, which artificial intelligence, and then comes big data. So this is a space in which Chinese are competing vigorously, and it's one in which, again, this is beyond I have no confidence in my own ability to see what's happening in this space. But if you ask folks at Google or Apple, they think this is the next big thing in terms of technology advances for the economy. And certainly in the national security world, where I live, we see the potential implications of that everywhere across the security agenda. So I probably am more concerned about the negative sides of this than the positive opportunities for dispute resolution that you're thinking about. Trying to assess the comparative or handicap, the race between the Americans on the one side and the Chinese on the other in this arena is a good illustration of the dynamic that we're watching. So at the meeting I was in Beijing 3 weeks ago, this was the China Development Forum, and there were the chief executives of all the American technology companies, so Google, Apple, IBM, as well as the Siemens and the Europeans. And there were the Chinese guys, the Baidu and so forth. And I was actually somewhat distressed by the extent at which the leads of the American companies had concluded that there was just so much talent in China and so much data in China and so much growth business potential in China that was that was half of their mind share of where their future was going to be. Because in the security realm, as I said to the Google guy, look, we opened this huge AI research lab in Beijing in conjunction with Tsinghua University, because there's so much talent there. So I appreciate that. But doesn't this create some concerns for you? And he was looking like, what's... And I said, well, half of the people there work for you in the daytime and work at night for the Chinese government. He said, and he went off and wanted to talk to somebody else. So I think this is going to be problematic, and I'm afraid the uses of it in the competitive area are likely to be more applicable than constructive. Sure.
Yes, Jeffrey Sachs recently spoke to the same group that there's not much research done in Washington. The ones who are doing research is the Pentagon and the lobbyists. And the congressmen just get some bill by NRA or other lobbyists. Now, if you look at China, it's a totalitarian country. Who does the thinking there compared to Washington?
Well, that's a good question. So Jeff was at this meeting in Beijing as well, so I know him. I'd say that's a little bit of a caricature of Washington, because there's some, we all know some members, and we all know some staffers who are thoughtful and serious people, and there certainly is some research this time. My book, for example, HR made reading for all the NSC people. I went there and did a seminar for a couple of hours with the whole team, and they had all read, were thoughtful, serious. So we have a lot of quite able people working in Washington. So I'd say I wouldn't quite take that caricature. On the other side, though, your question, on the Chinese side, they say we have a meritocracy in which we test people at every level, and they do. They have this almost in the way that of the Mandarin system, thousands of years ago. They do a competitive test, and they score the test fairly. And the smartest kid gets to go to this place, and so they have ranking, what they are. Then they say, in our system, the party runs everything. And if you had any doubt about that, look at the speech Xi Jinping gave in October at the Party Congress. He says, the party runs the economy, the party runs the society, the party runs the military, the party runs the country. Quote, the party runs everything. So they think some 2, 3, 4, 5% of the people become members of the party, and they are the vanguard that leads things, but then they think they pick them in a hierarchical, for the hierarchy through meritocracy. So Xi Jinping goes and is in the village, and he's in a city, a little city, and he's in a province, and he's in a bigger province. And so they test him out at many levels. And in their bureaucracy, if you look at their folks in the foreign ministry, or their folks in the finance ministry, or their folks in the central bank, or the people they sent to the international financial institutions, they train at institutions like Harvard, or in the US, they go through this meritocratic system, and they're pretty talented. And they start with a big pool of people. So I would say, they're pretty fact-oriented, they're pretty data-oriented, and that meritocratic system, they say, and they believe, even though it's authoritarian and party-led, is going to compete with our system, which is open, in which then we have an election and we end up with president, whoever it is. I mean, it's one of my Chinese friends who likes to make my life difficult. He says, Graham, let me tell you. He said, let's imagine a company like Amazon or Alibaba, the Chinese group. And let's say that they chose the head of the company by a lottery, in which the shareholders just voted, and they picked somebody who was a television star. So would you buy that company, or you would sell it short? Well, there's a buggy. There's a point. This lady, yes.
Yes, you talked about the conflicts, and there were 4 rivalries that did not end up in conflict. So I wondered if you could tell us who they were and what were the lessons learned from them.
Okay, so in the next to last chapter, I have 12 lessons for peace that come from the cases. If I took you through all of them, we'd be here for, not doing any questions. The 2 that I think are the most instructive for thinking about it now are the rise of Britain, the rise of the U.S., the rival Britain, at the beginning of the 20th century. So I have a great chapter in the book, which Americans always feel very uncomfortable with it, but it's called, What If Xi's China Were Just Like Us? Which we'd like to tell Chinese to be. But just like us, when we were feeling our oats as we were entering what we were confident was going to be an American century, and our leader was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is one of my heroes. So this was a hard chapter to write. But in any case, I tell the story through the eyes of Teddy Roosevelt arriving in Washington at the age of 37 in 1897 to become the #2 person in the Department of the Navy. And Teddy had for 15 years before that been giving speeches about the fact that it was an abomination, he called it, to have foreigners in our hemisphere. And he especially didn't like having the Spanish in Cuba. So he goes to Washington, 1897. In the decade that follows, what happens? So first, there's a mysterious explosion in Havana Harbor that, on the Maine, an American warship, and we declare war on Spain. And liberate Cuba, and take Puerto Rico, and we pick up Guam as a spoil of war. Next, we sponsor and support an insurgency in Colombia, create a whole new country, Panama. And the next day gives us our contract for the canal, so Getty ships can go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Then we threaten war, first with Germany and then with Britain, unless they back out of a territorial dispute in Venezuela. And then we can go on and on and on. Okay? We actually steal from Canada, the part I like. It's a great piece in the chapter from Canada, the biggest part of the fat tail of Alaska. So if you look at Alaska, there's this big blob, and then there's a 500-mile tail that goes down to Juneau that cuts off Canada from the sea. Where did we get that? I go fishing there, actually, in Tongass National Forest, which is the biggest American national forest. We stole it from the Canadians, and it's a good story that goes with it. So if Xi Jinping should be like that, God help us. Then for sure, I know we're going to get to war. So from that case, though, what can we learn? So the British were facing a rising Germany, which was closer to home, and a rising America. And they didn't like it. You know, they thought, well, what to do? We got to be realistic. So they were realistic. They distinguished between what they call their vital interests, which they thought was the empire, that included Canada, as well as India and South Africa. And they worried about the Americans, especially Teddy Roosevelt, taking a bite of Canada, which he was actually interested in. He thought Vancouver might be another interesting state. So that was vital, they thought. And other things were just vested, just the way things had been done. So they didn't feel obliged to patrol their ships wherever. That was just how they'd been doing for 100 years. They didn't have to be the guys settling a dispute in Venezuela. That's not so big a deal for us. So because of that, by the end of this alignment, or realignment, by 1914, when World War I came, the U.S. became immediately the lifeline for Britain to keep it supplies and then credit. And then when we entered the war as their ally. So that's a great case of sort of distinguishing vital from vivid. The second case that I'll just get you to read about is the Cold War. And I have a good chapter or a good section on the Cold War, which is hard to believe, and which was a remarkable surge of imagination in which the Americans, rather than having a great war with the Soviet Union, in fact, adopted something, a long-term strategy for a Cold War, which ultimately, after 4 decades, succeeded. This gentleman.
In the 1980s, I was an international operations executive with IBM. And the State Department would come in and would ask us to invite, at the request of the Japanese government, invite people in to visit our facilities in the United States. And I must admit, I resented it. We would even refer to them as the mothers from brothers, or shall we say. I was totally wrong, because that became the foundation of the Japanese looking at our automation techniques and so on and so forth, and establishing fabulous facilities for Toyota, for Nissan, and so on and so forth. You can go right down the line, and it also helped make Japan the second biggest economy in the world. So could that not be a parallel here with China, that we could have embraced them, work with them, and have us do things in their country and have them do things in our country?
And the answer is yes, it could be a parallel, but you have to think of the similarities and as well the differences. So there's no question that that's been our strategy so far, to embrace, invite in, and entangle China in the international system that had been constructed in the hope that this will be enriching of Chinese, and that as they're enriched, they'll become more like us in some respect, in the sense that you'll have a big middle class, which they do, and that the middle class will demand rights, and that that'll require law and order for contracts and business as well as for, and then this will produce a democracy, and democracy will produce peace. That was the storyline about the end of history that we celebrated for a while after the end of the Cold War. And if you want a good read of it, look at Fukuyama's end of history. That's more common words, the world is flat. So that was the theory of the case in the Clinton administration. That was the theory of the case in the Bush administration. That was the theory of the case in the Obama administration. And now Washington has awakened to another reality, which is that the Chinese don't want to be Americans, they say. At least Xi Jinping doesn't want to be. They don't want to have a democracy, he says. They want to have their form of government. And they don't want to have human rights as we understand it. They want to have their conception of human rights, as they say. So, in the Japanese case, this was helped for a substantial period of time by the fact that because there was a Cold War and there was another enemy that they worried about more, the Soviets, they were under our wing, under our tent. And in fact, even though the bases we have there now are voluntary, there's 50,000 American troops in Japan, and we're their security blanket. So the Chinese don't imagine that we're their security blanket. They see us as more threatening than that. So I think that's the differences in this case may turn out to be more significant than the similarities. This gentleman.
You raised, or you mentioned two things, live fire exercises in the South China Sea, and obviously there's the discussion with North Korea. How do you see those two opportunities for trouble as well as for relaxation of relations developing?
Okay, all of these, I'm sorry, I could give a lecture on these, but I can try to give just the tip of that iceberg. So, on the South China Sea, I have a chapter in the book called From Here to War. So, since everybody knows war would be so stupid, the temptation is to believe that, of course, there can't be a war. And then I should say, go back and read my chapter in 1914. Because at the end of that war, everybody said this was a kind of catastrophe. How did we ever let this crazy thing happen? But they did. So, one sure path to war, is Taiwan. The Chinese are as confident that Taiwan is part of China as Americans are that California is part of America. And if the Mexicans ever became strong and they wanted to take back the part of California that we stole from them, we would fight them and there wouldn't be any doubt about it.
I'm not sure.
Well, maybe not everybody would listen, but for sure, that's what Chinese think. So watch this space, unfortunately, because with the appointment of John Bolton, who is dangerous, I would say, view, he wants to put Taiwan back in play. And I would say that's a place where, that's a great way to get to work. On North Korea, I also describe that as one of the paths to war. And I would say that's the most plausible path to war, because if we get a failure in the Trump, Xi Jinping, the Trump Kim Jong-un summit, which is what the expert community is saying, then we're going to be back to where we were before. And where we were before was Kim Jong-un conducting ICBM tests, and those tests will give him the ability to strike California, and many Americans, not all of us, but many Americans will regard that as unacceptable. Donald Trump does. And so he may attack them. And if he attacks them, we'll have a war in the Korean Peninsula. And if we have a war in the Korean Peninsula, remember what happened in the first Korean War, where we fought the Chinese. So I say and that's why I'm hopeful prayerfully hopeful that that they'll have what I wrote a piece about this in Politico in November, saying, here's my bets about what's going to happen in 2018. And this one would be a minor miracle in which they declare some version of a solution, which won't be a solution, it'll just be the headline, but then they at least start a process of negotiation. And every year the negotiations goes on, there won't be a war. So that's better than the alternatives.
We are tight for time because Dr. Allison has to catch a car, so please join me in thanking him very much.